Brother Karel ran. Ignoble for an Astartes, but with his drop pod off course and burning somewhere behind him, all of his squad still inside, he saw no other choice. This road would take him to the courtyard, where Severail's squad was to establish a checkpoint. There he could still be of some use, even if his original deployment had gone awry. He ran faster, moving quicker at the sounds of chittering jaws and scrabbling claws behind him. He turned momentarily, firing a few hasty shots into the horde. He didn't need to aim. He could have fired blindfolded and still hit one of them, such were their numbers. He rounded the final corner, the claustrophobic hive alleyway opening into a gilded stone courtyard. There was no Severail. There was no checkpoint. There was no sign that they had ever even been. Karel could not feel fear. He could feel sorrow. How the Xenos had gotten to Severail and his squad, Karel didn't know. The question seemed unimportant now. Karel mounted a plinth at the center of the square, a short thing that held only the truncated legs of a broken statue. His bolter bucked as he hurriedly tried to stem the chitin tide that washed toward him. They were too many. Sorrow melted into resignation. Resignation catalyzed into a rage that bit black behind his eyes. He would not survive. That was assured now. He could ensure that as many of these Emperor-forsaken insects would meet his same fate before veteran brother Karel was sent to meet the Angel.
Blood Angels have always been my army. I guess technically I started Grey Knights first, but I didn't even finish painting their combat patrol. Sorry. But we were talking about red. What really attracted me to Blood Angels was the lore, by far. I'm a fan of anything related to vampires, so space vampires with space vampire wizards was kind of a right fit.
But that left me with a big red problem. Like many people, I've never been a fan of the Games Workshop paint style. It looks great on box art, but I'm playing with my minis, not selling them. I don't want my miniatures to feel like miniatures, I want them to feel real. Like the board game we're playing is an actual war zone, and our little plastic spacemen are actual marines, soldiers, or war machines.
You probably gathered as much from the intro that started this year's Stern Guard Veteran, but to me, mini wargaming is about more than just gaming, it's about storytelling. With my miniatures, I want to tell a fully fledged story. I don't want the battle to feel like a game, I want it to feel like an actual battle. And the best way to get that storytelling ball rolling is by playing with miniatures that each have their own individual stories to tell. To do this, we're going to primarily use stippling and sponging. Not only will this build up a great, gritty, grimdark texture, it's also going to speed up our painting process by quite a bit. This video is going to double down on that, as I show you guys how I paint my battle-ready Blood Angels. We're going for miniatures that have tone and atmosphere, but don't require hours upon hours for each marine.
To show you this, I'm going to be painting this Stern Guard Veteran. He's a good balance between plain armor and extra bits, so he'll be a good base for us. We're going to start by pinning him to a cork handle. This is absolutely optional, but I find that it's helpful to get into all the nooks and crannies on a miniature, and attaching him to his base might get in the way of that. But now that we're ready to go, we're going to hit him with some black primer. You can use whatever you have on hand and are comfortable with. I just use a quick rattle can spray.
Now this step might feel a little bit pointless by the end, but trust me and stick with me here. We're going to spend a little bit more time undershading and value sketching before we start slapping base coats onto our mini.
To do this, we're going to take a few monochrome paints, working from a medium gray up to a pure white. We're going to start with Army Painter Deep Gray. Using a dry brush, I'm just going to hit the high spots of the miniature with a fairly dry layer of paint. This is only our first layer, so you don't have to be too sparing with it, but make sure that you leave black primer in all of the recesses and shadows on the mini. Next, we're going to use Vallejo Sky Gray, making sure to apply it a bit more carefully. This will help set our midtones, so we want to make sure that we're only hitting the more upturned or raised areas with this pass. And finally, we're going to repeat the same process with Army Painter Matte White, being extra careful with this pass to only hit the highest surfaces and edges that would be receiving the most light on our mini.
Now here's a good time to pause and talk about one of the most crucial aspects of this painting style: light.
GW box art style doesn't usually work too much with light. It's designed to show off as many details on the model as possible so that you see as much as possible when you're buying it. Pretty much every edge is highlighted regardless of where it is on the mini and how much shadow it should be in. It looks great on the box and it's a super hard style to master, but it just kind of lacks atmosphere.
I've been told this is a marketing thing and not GW just really liking the look of denim, but jury's still out on that, I think. Instead, we're going to be using something called volumetric highlights. Now that sounds technical, I know, but trust me, it's not too bad. Basically, all that it means is we're going to be applying our highlights based on how light would fall on the different shapes of our miniature. To see what I mean, take a look at your dry brush miniature. See how the higher spots are brighter, the darker spots are still pretty much black, and the in-between spots are somewhere in between. That's basically the gist of it. That shows how light would fall on the brighter parts versus the recessed parts, and we can use this dry brush mini basically as a map as we go forward in our painting. So take a picture of this, or just keep a mental image if you're that good, and keep it in mind as we keep painting the rest of our mini. Speaking of, let's go ahead and get to base coating.
Here I'm applying a mix of brigandine brown and black. The brown sets up a nice, warm, dirty base tone, while the black darkens it down just a little bit. We're going to apply this all over our miniature's armor, basically anywhere that we want to be red. Make sure to take your time with this, as we want smooth coverage over our primer and our undershading. This base coat will help to establish some gritty, dirty recesses in our miniature, while also shifting our black base coat to a slightly warmer hue. Some of this brown will still be visible in the recesses, so again, make sure to apply it nice and smooth. Now we've got a very dirty looking Space Marine, but it's time to make him look like a Blood Angel.
I've already mentioned texture a couple times, but here's where it really starts taking shape. From here on out, we're going to be using less and less actual brush-on application, and more stippling and sponging. Now, this is a pretty straightforward process, but there are a couple weird things that we need to keep in mind. Mainly, we don't want our paint to be too thick. Not only will it make our color transitions too stark and too noticeable, it'll also start building up physical paint on our miniature. And while we're going for texture, that's not exactly the kind of look that we're going for. So make sure to thin your paint as usual and keep an eye on how stark your transitions between colors are.
Now, like I mentioned, there are kind of two options here. The first is sponging, literally using a piece of sponge, or in this case packing foam, to apply your paint. This is pretty easy. I just take a small scrap of foam, pinch it in a pair of tweezers, rough it up a bit for more texture, and call it good.
This is kind of the fast method. It'll build up texture and color on your miniature pretty darn quick, but you sacrifice a lot of control to do it. But if you're going for just an army-wide, quick and dirty paint scheme, this might be the best method for you. However, if you want a little bit more control, but you still want to build up that texture, you can also just use an old messy brush. This will give you the right texture while giving you a lot more control over where you put your pigment. It's what I use in all of my minis, and really it's the one that I recommend the most. Now let's go ahead and talk color. For this miniature, I'm going to be using these 4 paints.
Vallejo Hull Red, Citadel Wordbearers Red, Citadel Mephiston Red, and Armied Painter Angelic Red.
These are just the paints that I use that I find fit my process the best. However, if you will need to cut down on them and would prefer mixing your paints, you absolutely can. I would recommend picking up the Vallejo Red Hull still, as it's a great desaturated base tone, and a Mephiston Red, as it's a nice medium middle ground between our highlights and our shadows.
Now we're going to go ahead and start sponging on our miniature. We'll start with Hull Red for our first layer. This is a nice slightly desaturated red that starts to build up our color while not making the jump from our base coat too noticeable. As we're putting this on, make sure to keep our original brown base coat visible in the recesses. As we build up our layers, the brown will start to read as dirt, grime, rust, and any other kind of grit and weathering that builds up in the corners and crevices of our armor. Other than that, this is a pretty straightforward layer. Just keep some of that brown in the edges and recesses and you'll be good to go. Tried to apply most of this layer with the sponging technique, but there are still a few cracks and crevices that I couldn't get into that I still wanted to be red. So this is where I broke out my messy brush. This is just an old brush that I've used for quite some time and the bristles are starting to kind of fray. I just used this to build up texture and get paint where I wanted to where the sponge won't reach. Next up we have Wordbearers Red. This retains the somewhat desaturated nature of Hull Red, but is still noticeably brighter. I applied this layer and really all the others from here on out with a brush, since pigment placement starts becoming more and more important. We want to place this color within the areas that we just applied Hull Red to, leaving some of the Hull Red visible just like we did with the brown base coat. There are a few more layers yet to come, so don't worry about this being all too tidy, but just try to keep a bit of our previous layer visible.
Now once we got that done, let's take a second to come back to our discussion on light and shadow. From here on out, it becomes increasingly important to be conscious of where we're sticking our highlights. This style isn't trying to put our mini in even lighting like GW's product pictures. Instead, we're trying to stick him in a scene. We want it to be atmospheric, tonal, and reflect how light would actually fall on him if our miniature Space Marine was an actual Space Marine. I'm going to assume that you want your light source somewhere up above your miniature. That's usually where the sun is, after all. So, to reflect that, go ahead and take a look at your miniature from straight down.
Notice which surfaces you see the most of. The tops of the pauldrons, top of the head, maybe the back of the shin if your marine is in a moving pose. Each of these are areas that will receive more light and therefore need to be highlighted brighter. Now, of course, light doesn't work that literally. Certain areas, like the side of the shin here, are going to be lighter too, even if they're not in open light.
I promise this will get easier and more intuitive with practice, but for now just try to follow those pre-sketched highlights that were on your dry brush miniature. Follow the brighter high spots, the darker low spots, and you pretty much can't go wrong.
With this in mind, we're going to move on to Mephiston Red. Think of this as our mid-tone. It's the color that we more or less want our MIDI to read as. So here, we're going to apply our Mephiston Red within our Wordbearers Red areas, focusing more on the upwards facing surfaces. If it helps to think of this layer as a mid-tone, think of our previous layers as our shadows. Our layers are slowly working brighter as we go, so we want to leave those darker areas in the recesses.
Okay, so after the Mephiston Red, things get tricky. I've found that highlighting Grimdark Red with orange is a really nice way to contrast the deeper, colder shadows. However, orange can be a very overpowering color. Think traffic cones and safety vests. So if we use too much of it, or even just a little bit of it in the wrong places, it can make our miniature read as orange more than red. And we don't want that.
We're moving into our last few layers now. Next, we're going to mix Mephiston red with a bit of angelic red to make for a more warm orange-red highlight color. Like I mentioned, orange can be pretty commanding in a color scheme, so we're going to want to thin this out a little bit more than our previous layers, just to make sure we don't end up with angels resplendent instead of blood angels. This layer is also going to really set us up for our extreme highlights. Be extra careful to only use this on the brightest, most upwards-facing surfaces and areas on our mini. Go light with the paint, double check where your light would be coming from, and don't rush. You can always fix mistakes, but the easiest way to do that is to not make them in the first place. Now for our final layer. This one is definitely the most nerve-wracking to me. We're going to be using straight angelic red, pretty heavily thinned down, to apply our brightest highlights. This is only for the most extremely lit surfaces, like the tops of the reactor vent, top of the knee, foot, and maybe the tops of the arms. Be very careful with this. Mistakes, as always, are fixable, but this layer can really appear stark if you're not careful. So keep it thin and make sure you still have some of your previous colors on your palette to fix any mistakes.
And with that, the bulk of our painting is done. I know that was quite a few layers, but that's kind of the beauty of this process. Really, anywhere along this line, as long as you're happy with the end result, you can go ahead and stop with the layers. Now, maybe your miniature might not read directly as blood angels, but if you're going for, say, flesh terrors or word bearers, the darker color might be better for you anyway. But that said, if you're sticking with me through the end of this, why don't we spend a little bit more time on the cleanup step first?
This is the chance for me to go back over the miniature and mess with things I wasn't happy with. Maybe some of my highlights got too bright, or maybe I covered a bit too much of my brown base coat. Either way, one of the most important things you can do here is go back in with your dark brown and reestablish our shadows and edges. You can see me here glazing my dark brown into the cracks and crevices and applying a bit more neat to the edges and corners of the armor that might get dinked up. This kind of works like edge highlighting, but using a darker color instead of a brighter one works with our brown base coat to make the miniature feel more worn, chipped, and dirty, while still making each of our shapes easier to see and more recognizable. Now the last, most optional step here is to place some bright metallic chips and highlights on the edges that we just darkened. Be sparing with this, as we don't want to make the armor look fully trimmed with silver, but putting chips and scratches on more pronounced edges can reinforce our edge highlight, dark lighting, while also really bumping up the weathered feel. After I was happy with my cleanup on the red armor, I moved on to the rest of my mini. Now, techniques varied here, but I made sure to keep the same grimdark desaturated tone throughout, and once all of his bits and bobs were done, I stuck him onto a suitably grimdark base of obligatory gothic rubble, leaving me with this. Atmospheric, weathered, grimdark blood angel that looks like he's smack in the middle of a planet-wide conflict. While I painted this guy to my battle-ready standard, most of my other blood angels get a bit more TLC to really make them shine, but that's a topic for another video, so keep an eye out for that in the future. Now though, I'm going to go ahead and call this Sternguard done, and ready for whichever Xenos or Chaos Nasties come his way next.
And that's about it. This is a super versatile technique that I really recommend you try. I used it for red here, but of course you can use it with any number of colors with just a little bit of tailoring. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope this video gave you ideas on how to tell your own stories with your own miniatures. And if it did, why not hit the like button? If you know anyone else that might be looking for a video in a painting style like this, don't feel shy to share. If you're like me and you want to spend more time telling stories with your miniatures instead of just gaming with them, why not subscribe? Storytelling is my main approach to mini painting, and if you like this video, I bet you'll like some of the others that I've got cooking up soon. Until then, thank you all for watching, don't be afraid to tell your own hobby story, and of course, don't you dare go hollow.